And welcome. Yes, you are listening to CIUT 89.5 FM, the only alternative radio in Toronto. And you are listening live to Three Women. I'm your host, Sherry DeNovo, MPP Parkdale High Park. And because we're live, that means you get a say. Our phone number is 416-946-7000. It was interesting that beyond the headlines, if you were listening a little earlier, we're also featuring the same issue. We're talking about the right to die. And we have three amazing women who have made this their focus. First in studio for the hour, we have Ruth Von Fuchs, and she's the president of the Right to Die Society. She's been at this, I mean, she's been in and out of my life forever, but she's been at this for decades now. When a Canadian charitable group, Dying with Dignity, was started in 1980, she joined it. And when the Right to Die Society was started in 1991, doing the political work that charities can't do, she joined that as well. And since 2002, she has been the group's president. We will be joined very shortly by Dr. Jennifer Gibson as well. She's a Sun Life Financial Chair in Bioethics and Director at the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics, and Associate Prof in the Institute of Health Policy. And she recently co-chaired the Pan-Canadian Provincial-Territorial Expert Advisory Group on physician-assisted dying, and in that capacity, she is, of course, testified before a number of government committees. A little later in the show, Shanaaz Gokool will be joining us. He's the CEO of Dying with Dignity Canada. So we have quite the lineup of experts for you. And of course, we always love to hear from you. If you're one of those shy people, and I know some of you are, you can always tweet at me. You don't have to phone. You can tweet at me at CHERIDINOVO. Let me know what you'd like me to put into the conversation, ask my guests. But right now, welcome, Ruth, to Three Women.
Glad to be here.
So give us just a little bit of a background to this. Why are we all talking about this right now? What happened federally? What's been happening in this area with this issue?
Well, there was something quite momentous that happened federally with our Supreme Court. But the issue had been sort of simmering for quite a while in most developed countries, actually. Some countries had what's called a boomer generation, and we were one of those. The people in that generation are not accustomed to being told to shut up and sit down. And many of them saw their parents have a dying that they sure didn't want to have themselves. And many of them are now in their 60s, 70s, and dying is going to be their next big thing, and they are thinking about it. And they want to manage it and have a lot of say in how it turns out. But there were famous cases in Canada. There was Sue Rodriguez. In the U.S., there was Brittany Maynard. There have been several in the U.K. who haven't caused the changes that Sue and Brittany did, alas. But finally, some people came together with the help of the BC Civil Liberties Association. Some people offered to be sort of the faces of the case, people who had taken their mother to Switzerland so she could have a death of her choosing. And a volunteer from the community phoned them up and said, you need a person to be on your side and stand up and speak. And that was Gloria Taylor, who was facing the same disease Sue Rodriguez had, ALS. So these two women and a lot of other men and women put together a wonderful presentation. And eventually the Supreme Court, with gratitude to wonderful work done by Justice Lynn Smith in BC, they more or less said that she had done a fine job, and she had. And they said the same things she had, that the current laws violate our Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
So now it's been basically that ball has been kicked back to the federal government. So what's happening there?
Well, not a lot of the things that I would like to happen or that Shanaaz would like to happen, but they put forward a draft bill which contained something that had not even been thought of, I think, by the Supreme Court. A lot of the people who worked on the presentations to the Supreme Court and who worked on Quebec's law, which was very important, they didn't look south to the United States where a terminal illness is required. You have to be within 6 months of death. Oregon started that, and all the U.S. states that have had laws since then have copied that model. And there's a reason for that, and the psychologist in me knows what it is, and I will explain it in a minute. But they looked east across the ocean to Europe, and no European country requires terminal illness. Their criterion is a two-pronged one: intolerable suffering and irremediable condition. So if we can't fix it for you, we're not going to make you bear it. And that struck the Supreme Court as the way to go, and that's what they suggested in their ruling. But the bill put forward by the Justice Minister does look south, does require, not in those exact words. Instead of saying that the condition has to be terminal, which is defined as less than 6 months left to live, they said first the death had to be reasonably foreseeable. And the minister said she chose that language, deliberately vague, to give medical practitioners the room to use their judgment.
So in other words, you could be in incredible agony, but not necessarily have a terminal date. And
yes,
that would not count.
If your doctor thinks it's okay, it's okay. And if your doctor doesn't think it's okay, it's not.
We're joined now by Dr. Gibson. Dr. Gibson, welcome to Three Women.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to join you today.
Yeah, so you're speaking to Ruth von Fuchs in the studio, and she is very much here, present and live, as you can hear. And we may be joined by callers who call in as well. I'm already getting tweets from listeners. So just outline maybe a little bit of your perspective on this issue. And we've come to this place at this time. It is the topic, top of mind topic for many. What's your participation in this?
So my role in this had really started when I was co-chair of the Provincial-Territorial Expert Advisory Group on physician-assisted dying, which was a collaboration of 11 out of 13 of our provinces and territories. And our mandate was to provide advice to the provinces and territories on how assisted death might be implemented in Canada. And our starting point, the floor that we took, was the Carter decision. So when we tendered our recommendations last November and December, we were operating under what we thought were the parameters of the Carter decision. So you can imagine our surprise, not to mention the Special Joint Committee's surprise, which was the group that was including senators and members of Parliament that also provided recommendations to the federal government, that when Bill C-14 came out, that it was so narrowly focused on this sort of proximity to death, which was not at all how we had interpreted the Carter decision. And indeed, when, I think that many of us, when we first saw that bill, we were scratching our heads thinking, what did we miss? It seemed to be so much leaning in the direction of terminal illness, and yet so many of the cases that had brought this into the conversation, the Canadian conversation, had not been necessarily people who were on a trajectory towards death. They were suffering. They may have had progressive disorders, which might have been quite lengthy in their duration. And so, I think that, there's still some work to be done over the next weeks to get this sorted out.
Now, where is the bill at? Has it been to committee? Are amendments still in order, or is this the done deal?
Well, both the Standing Committee of the House of Commons has met and has tendered a set of recommendations, which are very, very minor amendments to the bill, really sort of tweaking around the edges rather than dealing with some of the substantive areas of concern that have been raised by many Canadians and, in fact, many parliamentarians who also were kind of surprised to see that the bill was as it is right now. The Senate Standing Committee has just wrapped up its hearings as well, and are, I understand, working on a draft report to the Senate with a number of recommendations. And my anticipation is that there will be quite a few substantive recommendations for amendment to Bill C-14. But of course, our deadline that we're moving towards is June 6th, which is only a couple of weeks away. Next week, the federal Parliament will be...
Why June 6th? Just
June
to let
6th.
Listeners know.
Oh, absolutely. So when the Carter ruling was first issued in February, on February 5th, 2015, we were given 1 year, the federal government was given 1 year to, if it chose, to come up with legislation. But of course, during that time, there was an election, and the new Liberal government went back to the Supreme Court to request a 6-month extension after that 1 year deadline, and the Supreme Court granted 4 months. So that is taking us from February of this year to June. So that's where the June 2016 is the date that everyone is working toward today.
And if the government doesn't act by June 6th, what are the ramifications there?
Well, I mean, the Carter decision stands. So, so the Carter decision is the current parameters within which somebody might be able to access an assisted death, and so it really then falls to the provinces to be able to find a response to respond to this. One of the concerns with that, of course, is that one of the significant shifts that have been taken is that there's been a reframing of this as a conversation about interprofessional teams providing support to patients at the end of their lives. The bill would, the new legislation would have protected, for example, nurse practitioners, nurses, social workers, and other members of that interprofessional team. Come June 6th, we'd be looking at, again, it's a physician bill, physician legislation, and so there are some concerns. Ideally, we would have legislation, but I guess the trade-off that many of us are contemplating is having legislation enough, or should we really be aspiring towards really good legislation at this point? And anyway, fingers crossed about some of what might come out of the Senate.
I'm going to go to Ruth in a minute, but I always think, and most people do because it's a fact, that health care is a provincial mandate rather than a federal one. So explain perhaps a little bit of the difference here. Why is the federal government weighing in on this? Because of the criminal aspect, I suppose, of what was on the books before. But if we move away from that, does that not, in a sense, bring in the provinces too?
It does. But I think you make a really good point. The Bill C-14 is outlining amendments to the criminal code, which does fall within the federal jurisdiction. The criminal code is federally governed. But because it does pertain to the application of such a code within a healthcare environment, the lines get a little bit blurry. And indeed, this is one of the things that I found from both the House, the Standing Committee of the House and of the Senate. We're very sensitive to that, about not encroaching too far into what is provincial and territorial jurisdiction, but finding what that line is something that I think all of the committees were trying to sort out. But I think in terms of some of what is outlined in the bill, they've got it just about right. Not too much intervention into what is really a healthcare space, but that does leave a lot for the provinces and the professional colleges to fill in the gaps in terms of guidance for health professionals, and then information for Canadians, for patients, to know how they might be able to have conversations about assisted death with their physicians, nurse practitioners, and others.
Now, many know that I'm a United Church minister as well as a provincial politician. Ruth, I'm going to kick this back to you. Since this discussion has happened, I've been tweeted at, and I even got a call from one of my professors way back in seminary days who wanted to weigh in on this. There is pushback on this, as there always has been. Where is that pushback coming from, do you think? And just, what's happening out there on the other side? Ruth?
Do you mean pushback against the idea
Against the idea, yes. Okay.
The human mind is a very sort of murky and strange and unclear place. And for instance, I think that the whole idea of requiring terminal illness is that many people think, they don't even know they think this, it's subconscious. They believe that there is a duty to live, that life is not just a right, it is an obligation. And that's why if you sort of cut your last class of the day and skip stages 7 and 8 of your final illness, that you have somehow cheated and that it's not a proper thing to do. And this is why the people who drafted Oregon's law, which was the first on this continent, there had been attempts before, and the attempts before suggested euthanasia as well as assisted suicide, and they also didn't have any requirement about being near death. But to make it palatable to voters and to doctors, Barbara Coombs-Lee and the others in the Brains Trust changed it. They said, okay, no euthanasia. Doctors will never have to take any action that will end someone's life. They can only write a prescription and then the person will take it from there. So that takes a lot of responsibility off the doctor's shoulders. It also is unfair to a lot of people, but I won't go into detail. I think you can imagine.
This reminds me of the whole abortion discussion in a sense of, there it was a woman's right to choose. The pushback was the sanctity of life, all life. This is a sanctity of life argument.
Yes, it is. No matter what it's like, it's sacred and you mustn't cut it short. And they also, that's why they put this in, besides assisted suicide only, not euthanasia. And Canada didn't buy that. Canada has allowed euthanasia, as the European countries do, so that's to our credit. And we thought that we were not requiring terminal illness either.
And so, Dr. Gibson, what's your take on the pushback that's still out there? I'm amazed, but it's still there.
I do think we have a bit of a clash of worldviews on this. Some people are coming at it, as Ruth's rightly pointing out, more from a protecting life perspective. Others are coming at it more from a personal choice perspective. So they're saying, the value of my life is defined by my values, what matters to me, and so on. So there's that orientation. And then there's also worldview that is really seeing this as a response to suffering and being called to respond to suffering. And sometimes those views align really well. But I think where we start to see some of the tension is where people might feel that it's encroaching too much on preservation, too much in the direction of preserving life at the expense of suffering or at the expense of personal choice. And this is where I think where the greater controversies come from is, and I think Ruth quite rightly points out, it's almost unarticulated, strongly held views that are now being surfaced that people weren't even aware of. And you can even hear this within the health professional community, who are certainly called to respond to suffering. That is, they do this every day, but they never really contemplated responding in such a way that might actually be perceived to actively bring about someone's death, even though there are a number of ways in which we hasten deaths in healthcare every day, and it's seen to be acceptable. So this is really a shift, I think, in people's thinking, but it's also a change process. People are having to adapt to a different options in the midst, and they're asking the question, I think quite rightly, what does this mean? This is important. This is significant. How do I think about this? I never had to think about it except in a theoretical way, and now it's real. And there's some folks are further out of the gate and being clear on what they believe. Others are still in the sort of sorting it out phase. So there's a sense of anxiety that comes from that I'm not ready, I haven't sorted it out yet, and yet this regime is being introduced, and I don't know what it means for me yet, even if they might be willing to support access to assisted death either for their patients or to support their colleagues who are providing it. So it's, there's a lot of, this is a very personal experience for most people, I would say.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening, of course, to Three Women on CIUT. Our two guests currently are Dr. Gibson on the line. She is the Chair in Bioethics and Director of the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics and Associate Prof in the Institute of Health Policy. She also recently co-chaired the Pan-Canadian Provincial-Territorial Expert Advisory Group on Physician-Assisted Dying. And we also have in studio Ruth von Fuchs, who has been at this issue for decades, president of the Right to Die Society, among many other hats that she wears. I want to throw you out this example because, when I've heard about this, and I've heard about it from my seminary prof to other folk, and mainly and mostly in the faith world, who say, well, here's the example. What about, everybody has periods of depression in their life, almost everybody anyway, and some almost to the, have contemplated suicide at some point, but, with therapy, you get over it and you move on. What about those? Their fear is, of course, that in one of those dark places, someone goes to a physician who is of like mind, and an opportunity is missed to heal thyself, in a sense. What do you think, Dr. Gibson? What do you do when you hear that?
Well, I have a lot of empathy for the quandary that people are struggling through there, because I think you're right. I mean, each of us probably has experience in our own lives or family members who went through dark times, and with appropriate social support and clinical support, were able to find a way to find meaning again in their lives. And at the same time, I've reached out to a number of psychiatrists to get insight from them to say, well, look, have you ever had a patient where, you did everything you could? That patient did everything he or she could And yet there just doesn't seem to be a way to break through this. And, it's not very many, but they say, yeah, there was the one or two patients. And I'm reminded of this line from Miriam Cade's book, All My Puny Sorrows, where one sister says to the other, one of the sisters has a history of suicide and several decades of mental health issues. And the one sister said, you've got to just try. And her sister said, well, I've been trying for 30 years. And, this was Miriam Taves this is a story about a conversation she had with her own sister who subsequently did commit suicide. But I think what it underscores is two things, that mental health or psychological suffering is real, that very often people with psychological suffering at this time would prefer to live well and to live happily, that this is not to choose death. It's not taken lightly. And at the same time, we want to provide support for people who might have episodes of suicide, desire for suicide, and ensure that they've got the support, give them the chance to do well. But it's certainly something the psychiatry community is trying to unravel right now. It's not so black and white. It's difficult.
And I know, Dr. Gibson, you have to go, but we also know, of course, when people talk about this, it's as if it's not going on. And, of course, we know it is going on. Doctor-assisted suicide is going on. It happens all the time. It's just, not talked. It hasn't been codified, if you will. So where the law hits the practice, as it were, in the medical community, what are you hearing from other doctors about what they're going to do if this bill, and I assume it'll probably go through unamended if it's where it's at now without any, one can hope, but if it does go through in its current form, what will this mean for your average GP or for the doctors in the field who have been doing their own thing for a while now?
Well, what I have been hearing is that, and we've seen some of these surveys, is that, about a third of clinician physicians would be willing to actively participate in a medically assisted death. Others are sitting on the fence, and then there would be, say, another third who would be adamantly opposed to it and would never come near it. But I think one of the things that we're hearing more than anything else is that to talk about assisted death in isolation is to forget that it's usually part of a larger conversation about somebody's wishes about death and dying. And so clinicians are saying, look, I need to learn better how to have these conversations about death and dying with my patients. And that I think is where we need to be focusing at least as much attention, is to supporting patients and their health providers to have those conversations, not just when things become a crisis or very acute, but early, and really opening up those conversations in a way that feels safe for everybody. And that applies to those physicians and other health providers who are proponents of assisted death, and for those who may not be, and for those who are sitting on the fence, because nevertheless, they're being called to care. And so part of that caring conversation is about that person's wishes around death, which may end up being a request for an assisted death, or it may not be. So we need to do better, and you can really hear the professional colleges and associations coming together to say, what can we do to better support health professionals in those conversations?
I lied. There's one last question I have, and then I definitely will let you go. But the other issue that comes up a lot is palliative care and end of life care for those who might not want assisted. And since, as we all know, healthcare is being cut in many provinces and jurisdictions, and it's difficult to get quality care, particularly if you're in remote areas in the northern Ontario, et cetera, et cetera. So the argument put forward is, well, we need, the first thing we need is good palliative care and good end-of-life care, because you can't really make a good decision if you don't have that as an option. Your response?
I don't see those as polar opposites. I actually think that if you look at many of the cases, even some of the cases that have gone through constitutional exemption since February this year, many of the people who requested an assisted death were receiving palliative care. So these were folks who other things mattered to them. It was my personal wishes, I've got a great team around me. I've got a psychiatric support and palliative care support, and yet I'm still seeking assisted death. We also know that in Washington, for example, many people who are requesting assisted death also are seeking palliative care. And then in the European countries, those countries with that do offer euthanasia also have seen increase in access and the quality of palliative care. So I would say let us see this as a sort of a much more comprehensive conversation about how we die well in Canada, and not just landing this on the shoulders of palliative care physicians, but really taking a palliative approach in the sense of conversations, psychosocial support, and other support for persons approaching conversations about their death or their own death, within which one might see this option of an assisted death, a medically assisted death, as one option, not as something that is off by itself and disconnected from that whole continuum of support for Canadians.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gibson. Pleasure to have you on. Ruth, I'm going to go back to you. I love that, how we die well. Now, you've been at this a long time and looking at legislative change that entire time, but you've also been there when people have died well. What does that look like? Because we're most people don't want to contemplate their own deaths, don't think about it until it's too late and it's in somebody else's hands. And what does a good death look like?
Well, I think of two things. I think of the picture that Kay Carter's daughter, Lee Carter, took of the whole family. Well, several of Kay's children went with her to Dignitas in Switzerland, and they all sat on a sofa, and somebody took their picture, and they all look very, very happy, especially Kay, the one who was about to die, because she had sort of engineered this whole thing, and her children, much better children than some people are blessed with, they supported her entirely and went with her, some of them, and they're all sitting there looking pleased as punch.
And what would she suffer from?
She had spinal stenosis, and her children were horrified when they read the draft of this bill because it talked about reasonably foreseeable death, and they think that their mother would not have been seen to qualify by most doctors. The Justice Minister insists that she would have qualified, that some doctor could have interpreted her situation as death being reasonably foreseeable. But she could have suffered for years and years and years, actually, I think, in deteriorating condition with more and more pain and less ability and so on and so forth for certainly a very, very long time. So,
and certainly that caveat that's in the bill puts a lot of power in a physician's hands.
That's precisely what it does, and I think it's why doctors like it so much.
Rather than the recipient of the medical care.
Yes.
We're just about at halftime. We're going to take a bit of a break, listen to a tune, and we're going to come back and keep on talking. And you too can be part of the conversation. Thanks for your tweets. To talk about physician-assisted suicide, of course, the bill that's before the federal government right now, but some women who've been involved in this for a very long time. And I'm so honored to have Ruth Von Fuchs in the studio, president of Right to Die Society, because she's literally been on this for decades. We're going to come back. We're going to hear from Shanaaz Gokool as well. And as, of course, you heard, if you've been listening, you heard from Dr. Gibson. There's a quote that kind of comes to mind. I think I saw it on Facebook. Where else does one see things these days? But it was from as old as the hills. It was from Atticus, Roman. And he said, when I die, I want to be in love, I want to be happy, and I want to be a little drunk. So on that note, let's listen to a tune. We'll be back shortly.
I awoke today and found the frost perched on the town. It hovered in a frozen sky, then it gobbled summer down. When the sun turns traitor cold and all the trees are shivering in a naked row, I get the urge for going, but I never seem to go. I get the urge for going when the meadow grass is turning brown and summertime is falling down and winter's closing in. I had me a man in summertime. He had summer-colored skin, and not another girl in town my darling's heart could win. But when the leaves fell on the ground and bully winds came around, pushed them face down in the snow, he got the urge for going, and I had to let him go. He got the urge for going when the meadow grass was turning brown and summertime was falling down and winter was closing in. Now the warriors of winter, they give a cold, triumphant shout, and all that stays is dying, all that lives is getting out. See the geese in chevron flight, flapping and a-racing on before the snow. They got the urge for going, and they got the wings so they can go. They get the urge for going when the meadow grass is turning brown and summertime is falling down and winter's closing in.
Right here, right now, every day. CIUT 89.5, Toronto. Sound of your city.
And welcome back. You are listening to Three Women, and of course, we have Ruth von Fuchs in the studio. She is the executive director of Right to Die Society and has been on this issue for a long time. Of course, we're talking about the changes in law about to come our way from the federal government, and also what does it look like to die well when you want to, not when perhaps nature wants you to. And that really is the subject of our conversation. You're welcome to phone in 416-946-7000 or tweet me at CHERIDINOVO at Sherry DeNovo. I'm your host. We're also joined by Shanaaz Gokool. She's the CEO of Dying with Dignity Canada, and they really are the leading organization helping Canadians avoid unwanted, unnecessary suffering. Shanaaz has had quite a lengthy background. Really, as a human rights activist all of her life. She was a member of Amnesty International and chair of the Amnesty International Toronto organization between 2009 and 2014. Shanaaz, welcome to Three Women.
Oh, wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Sherry.
Yeah, so you've probably heard a little bit of the conversation, or if you haven't, I'll fill you in. But of course, we're talking about the coming changes in law. And the concern Ruth has raised, as well as Dr. Gibson, who was on earlier, is that there seems to be this concept in the bill itself that you need to be suffering from terminal illness before you're going to be able to have the assistance of a physician. What's your take on the bill? What do you think needs to change?
You know, I think the bill as it is now is really quite disappointing. We think that the definition of how the government has defined what a grievous and irremediable medical condition is problematic is an understatement. They've introduced a number of new terms, such as incurable, advanced state of irreversible decline, and of course the one that many people have been talking about, that their natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. And these are all terms that were not in the Supreme Court's decision, and at best, some of them, especially the reasonably foreseeable, is nonsensical because everyone's death is reasonably foreseeable. We're all
terminal cases.
Yeah, or it's really about saying terminal, and if that's the case, they should just say that, because as it is now, there's not enough clarity, and most doctors, I believe, will look at this and will err on the side of extreme caution and will interpret it as being for people who are terminally ill. And in fact, on Friday, the Quebec health minister in Quebec has had their own legislation in effect since late last December. Their legislation is for people who are terminally ill, have advised doctors to follow their legislation because there's too much risk associated with the federal government's legislation.
Which is very concerning for physicians. But we also made the point earlier, and I'm going to have Ruth weigh in on this because you've got some excellent recommendations here as to what you think should be changed in this bill, that this really does put the power in the physician's hands and not in the person's, as it were, not in the patient, to really die well, which is ultimately our aim, I would hope. Ruth, do you want to talk about your recommendations of the Right to Die Society for the bill?
Okay, I suggested. Can I have it back,
Yeah,
Sherry?
there you go. You've got 4 of them. Yeah.
The first one involves the reasonably foreseeable death thing. I think that's actually a reflection of the widespread assumption, sort of a vague, nebulous belief that people have a feeling that life is not just a right, it's an obligation, that you have to hang in there, no matter how horrible it is, and to do anything else is to be cowardly or wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's why people feel, on this side of the Atlantic anyway, that legislation about end-of-life care should require that you be pretty close to death. They don't make those requirements in Europe. They just require in Europe the 2 things that the court mentioned. And the court had been looking east, irremediable condition and intolerable suffering. Okay. So that 2-pronged approach is what we want to go back to. The court does speak of consent. It's a term that's familiar to people: informed consent, treatment consent to treatment. But I think that has a very old-fashioned flavor, and I think actually in a law about death, the word consent would alarm many people. I think we should speak in terms of the doctor's role is to provide information about options, to present a menu, and explain the both upside and downside of each option. And medical assistance in dying would be one of the options in many cases. And then the patient makes a choice. All kinds of groups talk about choice in dying, and people like that idea. They want to be seen as being sort of, it's an informed choice instead of informed consent. They make a selection that's in keeping with their values and their fears and their hopes. My third suggestion probably doesn't have a hope. I said consider permitting not only escape from suffering but also avoidance of it. In other words, allowing preemptive exiting. Probably it would be like assistance with suicide. People in those situations see something coming. They don't want to actually bother to start suffering. They'd prefer to not suffer, thank you. When they see this getting close enough, they would like to leave, to avoid it. And that would probably have to be limited to people who were willing to self-administer the medication. There wouldn't be suffering to move the doctor to do something. And then I made a comment about mental illness. To make an exception for people whose case is refractory, whose illness is refractory, and there are such people. They would be people, for instance, who've endured more than 5 years of treatment without adequate improvement, have tried more than 10 different drugs or treatments without adequate improvement, and have tried 3 or more different professionals or facilities without adequate improvement. And there are such people. I get calls from women who are now in their 40s or 50s, who made their first suicide attempt when they were a teenager, and who have spent all those decades in misery.
Mm-hmm. And Shanaaz, you heard Ruth's recommendations. What do you think of those?
You know, I think some of those are fine. I think what I'd like to just sort of speak, if I can, to is where these recommendations in the draft legislation came from. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really sort of the crux of what we're looking at and why it's really problematic. All of the colleges of physicians and surgeons who have a mandate to ensure that there is public trust in the healthcare system. Their whole, sort of a big part of their whole reason for being is to ensure that there are processes and protocols and that physicians know how to carry out various medical treatments in a way that ensures public trust. And they started consulting. They all have draft guidance. Most of them do. They started consulting in the fall. What's really noticeable is that not one of them in their draft guidance documents tried to redefine grievous and irremediable. And what was revealed last week in the Senate testimony when the president of the Federation of Medical Regulatory Authorities of Canada was asked if the colleges were consulted in the drafting of this legislation, he said no. So instead, the government went to the Canadian Medical Association, which does not have a mandate to ensure public safety in the medical system, and consulted with them. And so what you have now is legislation, as you were just saying, Sherry, that's very physician-focused, but is no longer patient-centered. And so I think part of the problem with the government's process is, why wouldn't you have gone? Why wouldn't you have invited the doctors' regulatory colleges to come and talk to you about what doctors are going to think when they look at, your eligibility criteria and who meets the requirement and who doesn't? And the colleges, the ones that spoke last week in the Senate, are having challenges trying to understand how they're going to explain that to doctors. And I think that is probably where I would start. Is why didn't the government go there first? And yes, for some of the recommendations, I mean, of course, we just think you should use the language of the Supreme Court, grievous and irremediable. And what's critical about irremediable, and you would think irremediable and incurable could be the same thing, except that the court made it quite clear that if irremediable does not mean you have to accept treatments that aren't acceptable to you, and it's a qualification that does not exist in the government's legislation when they talk about incurable. So they should just strike all of those things and just go back to the language of the Supreme Court's decision. And doctors have already, in the colleges, worked out protocols to help physicians explain and assess which people are going to be eligible for an assisted death under Carter.
So now, Shanaaz, when you have, and I'm sure you have, spoken to MPs about this, I mean, I know Rob Oliphant was one of those on the committee that was very, another United Church minister out there who was very involved, and you've raised these concerns. What is the response?
I think that it's a fundamental misinterpretation of what the intention of the Supreme Court of Canada's Carter decision was all about. From the government's perspective, certainly the way that the legislation reads, this is a bill just about people who are dying. But the court's decision wasn't limited to just people who are dying. When you look at Kay Carter, who had spinal stenosis and could have lived for a number of years, she wasn't terminally ill. Yet the government, in their backgrounder, the Department of Justice, they write the legislation and they send out these backgrounders to sort of explain why the legislation looks the way it does and what the potential violations to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms may be. They don't mention Kay Carter once in that document. It's almost like she wasn't a plaintiff in that case. And by doing so, they remove the concept that was integral in that decision, that this is about people who are suffering and want to end their suffering, as opposed to just people who are dying. And that is, I think, where there's a complete lack of understanding from the government about what the Carter decision was actually all about. And some MPs, I think, understand that. Certainly Rob Oliphant, who championed the Special Joint Parliamentary Committee report, understood that. But quite clearly, the government, in the current form of the legislation, has misread the court's intention.
And what are they afraid of? I mean, why do you think? I always look at what's on the other side, the pushback from whomever, wherever, political or not. What is it that led them in this direction? I'm sure they heard testimony, as you have just testified, and chose to ignore it. So, what do you think that's about?
Well, what's really interesting is that a lot of the discussions and so the issues around safeguards and vulnerable peoples, which are all legitimate and important issues, they were already tested by the courts at the trial and the trial level, and then at the Supreme Court. And what we had with the hearings at the House and the Senate over the past few weeks was basically Carter being tried again. And in terms of understanding the government's motivation, it's very difficult to understand if the rationale is that even opponents of assisted dying and the right to die advocates, that everyone is upset with the legislation, then that must be good legislation. That feels like a very shallow rationale from our perspective. And so then you're, asking yourself, like, what's really going on? It does feel, and Joe Arve, who argued the case at the Supreme Court, did say in his comments over the past couple of weeks that essentially the government has tried to retry Carter and has come out saying that Carter was just about people who are terminally ill. And if Carter was indeed about people who are terminally ill, they had the benefit of knowing that Quebec had legislation that was passed many months prior to their decision. They could have used the same words and made it quite clear, and they did not for a reason. So your guess is as good as mine in terms of what the rationale is, and I think it's something that Canadians need to ask, because this is a government that came into power promising that, one, to us and our organization when they released their election platform on assisted dying, that they would uphold the letter and spirit of the Carter decision, and two, that they would not bring any legislation before Parliament that wasn't in compliance with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And we think that they have violated both of those commitments with this particular legislation.
So do you think it's going to end up back at the Supreme Court? What's going to happen?
Well, I mean, this is a question, like, do we really have to ask more sick and dying people, chronically ill people, to show courage in the face of their suffering, to go back to court because this government is resisting meeting the minimum requirements of Carter? Our organization is very concerned about, advanced consent for people with a diagnosis like dementia or Huntington's or Parkinson's, and recognizes that, the court didn't weigh in on consent. They were neutral on consent. They didn't say when consent had to be obtained in order for a request for an assisted death to be valid. But they were very clear in their definition of who would be eligible. And so, I think that it feels like the government is asking some poor, sick, chronically ill, dying person to have to go back to court to establish what should have been established in this legislation.
Or just really kicked it into the hands of physicians who will make their own decisions about how they conduct their practice, I suppose.
Well,
which is also not, again, Ruth, do you wanted to weigh in?
I just want to say a cheering thing is that lists are being compiled of doctors who are going to be willing to presumably decide with the patient's values and hopes in mind. And there's one called Hemlock Aid that's being started on the West Coast. I think, Shanaaz, you are starting one. Apparently the CMA is going to have one. So this I find cheering and a bit hopeful.
So this is that what's going to happen to you? Do you think, Shanaaz, is that there will be physicians of like mind who will just go ahead?
I don't think we can rely. No, I think that sure there may be, but I mean we can't rely on someone understanding the legislation one way and another physician or healthcare provider understanding the legislation another way. That is not,
a responsible
and credible way for the government to operate. It has to be very clear. And I know the colleges now are struggling with trying to understand how will they make those rules clear for doctors who have to follow, yes, the legislation, but they have to follow what's consistent and what's been outlined by their colleges in the different provinces and territories. And when you have Quebec telling their doctors the federal legislation is too risky, follow ours, and ours is for people who are terminally ill, I see a real problem. And, doctors, they wanted clarity. They wanted, people want clarity. And what this legislation has done is it's done the exact opposite, so much so that most physicians are going to err on the side of extreme caution because the penalties are quite severe.
And what are those penalties? Because listeners would be interested to know that those penalties will still exist.
Those penalties of jail time are very, very real. And so I think that, that we have to have clarity. And if clarity means, because the legislation certainly seems to be saying you've got to be terminally ill, that's likely what will be advised. So if you have, multiple sclerosis where you could live for decades, or ALS, you're going to be, forced to live for a very long time and to endure a significant amount of suffering because you're not going to be covered in this legislation.
Now, has there, that's an interesting note, and we haven't just discussed that, but just before I let you go, Shanaaz, I would like you to address, has there been pushback from those in the disabilities community, activists around this in any way, shape, or form? And
Yes.
what are they saying?
Well, so there's a real disconnect between, one, people who identify as having significant physical disabilities, and two, the leadership of those organizations who are very opposed, have always been very opposed, and have been in court testifying in opposition to assisted dying. We know from our polling data that 85% of people with a significant physical disability support assisted dying. We also know
Joe
that
Arvey is one of
the
them.
lawyer who argued the case in the Supreme Court, Joe Arvey,
Yes.
is himself a paraplegic, and he outlined very clearly to the courts, that we can't treat people with physical disabilities in a paternalistic way or in a way that infantilizes them, because there's an assumption made that because you have a physical disability, you're not capable of making an informed decision on assisted dying. And that's really problematic because, you're excluding a whole group of people. It's actually further stigmatizing by telling them that they can't have access to an assisted death because they're so vulnerable that they're not able to make an informed decision.
So what's the way forward for you, Shanaaz, as the CEO of your organization? If this bill comes down the pike, looking like it does now, what will your next steps be?
Well, our first step, one of our first steps around the amended legislation was launched today, and we are asking MPs to vote against the bill, to say yes to Carter and no to Bill C-14. The likelihood, however, is that the legislation will be passed this week and it will go to the Senate. The Senate won't sit again until, I think, the 31st of May, and the senators have an incredible opportunity at that point to take the time to review the bill and make suggestions for recommendations that will bring the bill into compliance with both the Carter decision and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we will be calling upon the Senate to take their time and ensure that this bill has the proper review and study, so that they're not rushing it through. June 6th is not sort of, the sky will not fall if the legislation is not ready. Many of the colleges have draft guidance. It's more important for the senators to do their job and ensure that this legislation meets the minimum standards of Carter and has provisos within it to ensure for other groups of people, so people who want advanced consent or mature minors or mental illness, that if they cannot be addressed immediately in the legislation, that there is a mechanism where all three of those issues can be addressed within 2 years of the legislation passing. So
very quickly, Shanaaz, I know you need to go and we do too, but we were talking about how we die well. What would that look like? I mean, what should it look like in Canada to die well?
I think that there are a number of things. Just to be brief, I think people should have all of the options available to them in order to make informed decisions about what is in their own self-best interest. So whether that is, having options so that if you have a chronic illness where you meet the Carter eligibility requirement and you want to die, that's available no matter where you live. So you can die in your home, you can die in an institution, wherever you choose to, that you will be able to die. But also that people have, no one disagrees that there should be better access and improvements in palliative care, and that there should be national strategies to help inform other areas like aging, care for the elderly, dementia, mental illness. All of these things should be addressed so that people have actual choice in how they will die based on the tools and mechanisms that we are now putting into place.
Well, thank you very much. That was, of course, Shanaaz Gokool, Dying with Dignity CEO. Thanks for being on Three Women. And Ruth, we're going to go back to you, and you're going to take us out, so to speak, of the show.
I want to add a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely,
having
please.
a good death involves giving some power back to people who have lost an awful lot. And just having power again to make a choice, to do it your way. It almost brings them back to life sometimes.
I know. I mean, part of it is I guess it's almost Hollywood, isn't it? That, the miraculous recovery from the terminal diagnosis, or the the miraculous turnaround of a life that is held out there. So at some point, you as a person have to decide. I'm playing the odds in the favor of I'm going to die with dignity, and I'm not going to trust that I'm going to be the one in a million. That's part of it too, right?
I'm not sure I completely understand that, but
Yeah.
basically they have a psychic rebirth or a psychic recovery almost. They become themselves again for a little while.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love the picture of the family sitting on the couch and
That's what
being
Kay
together.
had. She was herself and in control to the very end.
It's interesting because as you were thinking about that, I was thinking of there have been a number of films made from the LGBTQ community when AIDS was such an epidemic of good deaths, of people having a party with their friends, deciding they were going to go down slowly, that they were not going to suffer, and that kind of, I think, in the popular imaginary from the cultural side, gave other folk an idea. Well, this could be me. I could be me. It could be
I would like
my
to have a
death.
death day party.
Yes. Yeah. So that's what you see in your future?
If I get warning, yes.
Which is what it's about. A couple of things before we go. Of course, we love to hear from you. So you've been listening to Three Women. We've had three phenomenal women: Ruth von Fuchs, Right to Die Society, Dr. Jennifer Gibson, who's been a little bit of everywhere on this issue, Shanaaz Gokool, Dying with Dignity CEO. But your voice is also important. So if you want to weigh in and you haven't so far, and thank you for your tweets, do send me messages. You can send them on Facebook. You can send them by Twitter. Again, just Sherry DeNovo, CheridIDinovo, about this or any future shows. I want to thank our wonderful tech Lisa, for both producing and teching the show. Our halftime music, which of course I didn't introduce, but you all know what it was. It was Joni Mitchell, a very appropriately Urge for Going, which, yes, some of us do have. And another important announcement too, Amy Goodman of Democracy Now!, who we all know, love, and listen to on this radio station, the only radio station, by the way, in Toronto that carries her, and it's the only real American news coming out. If you've been listening to the mainstream media in the States, it gets pretty depressing sometimes, but you tune in to Democracy Now!, you can see her in the flesh, Amy Goodman, or you could. It has been sold out, so that's my message. But she's coming here, and we're thankful for that, because that is a final fundraiser for our show. Again, to Ruth, to Jennifer, to Shanaaz, thank you so much. I'll just leave you with that Atticus quote, because unless, Ruth, do you have a quote that you like about dying?
Well, I'm just going to mention the website addresses.
Oh, please, yes.
Our
of course.
society's is righttodie.ca, and the other one is dyingwithdignity.ca.
So if you're interested, if you're facing this in your own life or with someone you love, you'll get incredible information from either of those sites. Ruth, thank you for doing what you've been doing for decades, because I know you have. Against all odds, it seems like your day is finally coming due. Maybe not quite in the way you wanted it. Never does, but it's coming due. And again, so I'll just leave you with the Atticus quote. I want to die happy, in love, and a little bit drunk. That's from Roman times, so nothing much has changed in that aspect of human experience. Till next time on Three Women. Thank you.